Ancient history is full of stories that sound invented. A Roman emperor who smothered his dinner guests in flowers, a Chinese emperor buried inside a river of poison, a state that trained teenage boys to murder in the dark. None of it is fiction. It happened, it was recorded, and in most cases the people responsible were proud of it. This is a walk through 10 of the strangest true stories from the ancient world, and why the truth is stranger than anything a screenwriter would dare to pitch. Each one comes from a different continent, a different century, a different form of government, and each one has survived long enough to be checked against physical evidence, contemporary records, or both. Nothing here needed exaggeration to make the list. Rome, 218 CE. The emperor is 19 years old, and he has a party trick. Elagabalus ruled the Roman Empire for 4 years before his own guard killed him, but the story that outlived him was a dinner. According to the Historia Augusta, he had a false ceiling installed above the banquet hall and packed it with rose petals. Not a handful, tons of them. Partway through the meal, the ceiling released. Guests laughed as the petals fell, then kept falling, burying several of them so deep they suffocated before anyone could dig them out. Historians debate how literally to take the Historia Augusta, since it was written generations later and loved a good scandal. The same source claims Elagabalus once served his court a banquet of a single color, changed daily, and released tame lions and leopards among sleeping guests with their teeth removed, purely to enjoy the panic. But the detail that survives every retelling is the petals. Nobody at that party thought to leave. They died at a party they were enjoying, buried under something soft. Ancient Sparta ran on a secret most Greek city-states pretended not to notice. The Spartan population depended on an enslaved underclass called Helots, and Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens by a wide margin. To keep that population from ever organizing, Sparta ran a program called the Cryptia. Select young Spartan men were sent out armed, alone, and unsupervised into Helot territory, with one instruction: survive off the land and kill any Helot who looked capable of leading a revolt. No trial, no warning. The Spartan state formally declared war on its own Helot population once a year, which under Greek law meant killing one wasn't murder, it was combat. Spartan boys entered military training, the agoge, at age 7, and the Cryptia was reserved for the ones who had already proven themselves the most capable of surviving alone. A society famous for discipline built that discipline on teenagers with knives, and a government that had already decided the victims didn't count as people. Modern historians still argue over how often the Cryptia was actually used versus how often it was invoked as a threat. But the threat alone was enough to keep an enslaved majority from ever organizing against the citizens who outnumbered them. China, around 210 BCE, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify the country, spent decades building a tomb designed to keep working after he was dead. The terracotta army buried around it, over 8,000 soldiers, each with a different face, was only the visible layer. Ancient records describe rivers of mercury built into the tomb floor to represent the empire's waterways, flowing on hidden mechanisms. Modern soil samples taken near the site show mercury concentrations far above normal background levels, which is the closest thing archaeology has to a smoking gun for a 2,200-year-old rumor. The workers who built the inner chambers, according to the historian Sima Qian, were sealed inside once the emperor's body was placed, so the tomb's location would die with them. The last thing many of them may have built was their own exit, permanently closed. The main burial chamber itself has never been opened. Modern archaeologists have deliberately left it sealed, partly out of respect for the historical record, and partly because nobody is confident the structure or its contents would survive contact with open air. Assyria didn't just win wars, it documented the aftermath in stone, in detail, on purpose. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, built one of the ancient world's great libraries at Nineveh, over 30,000 clay tablets, covering medicine, astronomy, and literature, including the oldest surviving copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The same king commissioned wall reliefs showing enemy soldiers impaled outside conquered cities, flayed alive or led away in nosehooks, carved with the same craftsmanship as the library's finest tablets. This wasn't the record of a barbarian. It was the record of a state that valued knowledge and terror equally, and saw no contradiction in funding both. When Nineveh finally fell in 612 BCE, the library burned along with the palace, and the fire baked the clay tablets hard enough to preserve them for over 2,000 years. The empire's greatest weapon against forgetting turned out to be the same fire that destroyed it. Aztec warfare in central Mexico followed a rule that would confuse a modern general. The goal in a Xochitlán, a flower war, was not to kill the enemy, it was to bring them home alive. Fought primarily against the neighboring Tlaxcala state, these were arranged, almost ritualized battles where warriors were trained specifically to injure and capture, never to deliver a killing blow. The captives were marched to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice at religious festivals, where their deaths served a different purpose than the battlefield ever could. Some historians read this as evidence of a religious economy that needed a constant supply of sacrificial captives more than it needed conquered territory. Two empires fought real wars with real casualties for the specific purpose of harvesting people for later. Spanish chroniclers arriving in the 16th century recorded the practice with open confusion, since it inverted almost every European assumption about why armies fought at all. Territory, plunder, and political control all took a back seat to a supply chain that ran directly from the battlefield to the temple steps. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the Mongol Empire did something almost unheard of for a ruler of that scale. It hid the body and the location forever. The funeral procession reportedly killed every person and animal it passed on the route to the burial site to prevent word from spreading. Some accounts describe a river being diverted over the grave itself once burial was complete, then returned to its original course, erasing any visible marker. Slaves who built the tomb were killed by the soldiers who escorted them, and those soldiers were killed in turn by a third group, closing the loop entirely. To this day, no archaeologist has confirmed the location of the most powerful man's grave in medieval history. The empire that conquered more territory than any other in history couldn't risk anyone finding where its founder was buried. Expeditions funded by universities and private researchers have searched the Khenti Mountains for decades using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, and everyone has come back empty. A man who once controlled roughly 20% of the Earth's land surface has no marked grave anywhere on it. Carthage, in North Africa, left behind a burial ground called the Tophet, and archaeologists have spent a century arguing about what it proves. Excavated urns at the site contain the cremated remains of infants and young children, mixed with animal bones, dated across several centuries of Carthaginian history. Greek and Roman writers, who had every political reason to make Carthage look monstrous after 3 wars against it, claimed the Tophet was evidence of routine child sacrifice to the gods Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Modern researchers are split. Some read the bone evidence as sacrifice on a shocking scale. Others argue it reflects a standard ancient cemetery for children who died naturally, at a time when infant mortality was brutal on its own. Nobody disputes that thousands of small urns are buried there. What they represent is one of the ugliest open questions in ancient archaeology. A 2010 study of the burned bone remains found evidence consistent with both prenatal and postnatal deaths mixed together, which only deepened the disagreement rather than resolving it. 2 research teams can examine the identical set of bones and walk away with opposite conclusions about what kind of society buried them there. Persian execution methods rarely needed exaggeration, but Scaphism might be the exception that reads like invention anyway. The method, described by the Greek writer Plutarch, involved sealing a condemned person inside 2 boats, face and limbs exposed, and force-feeding them milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. The exposed skin was then coated in more honey to attract insects. Death, when it came, took days, caused by dehydration, exposure, and infection rather than any single blow. Whether Scaphism was ever actually practiced at scale, or whether Plutarch was repeating second-hand Persian legend to a Greek audience that already saw Persia as the ultimate foreign menace, is still debated by historians. What isn't debated is that someone, in antiquity, thought this method up in enough detail to describe it convincingly 5 centuries later. Plutarch attached the account to a soldier named Mithridates, punished for a perceived act of disrespect toward a Persian king, and claimed the ordeal lasted 17 days before death finally arrived. The Vikings had their own execution ritual, and its authenticity is one of the most argued questions in Norse history. The blood eagle. Described in sagas written centuries after the Viking Age ended, the ritual allegedly involved cutting the ribs away from the spine of a living victim and pulling the lungs out through the back, arranged to resemble spread wings. It's mentioned in connection with several historical figures, including a claimed revenge killing tied to the death of Ragnar Lothbrok. Modern historians are largely skeptical that it was performed literally as described. The sagas were written by Christian authors generations later, with their own reasons to paint pre-Christian Norse culture as savage. But the fact that the story was told, believed, and repeated for centuries says almost as much about the culture that told it as the ritual itself would have. A handful of runestones and skeletal remains from the Viking Age show rib damage that some researchers have connected to the legend, though none of it is conclusive enough to settle the argument either way. Rome held one execution in reserve for a crime most societies didn't even bother codifying. A Vestal virgin breaking her vow of celibacy. The Vestals were priestesses tasked with keeping Rome's sacred fire burning, and Roman law forbade spilling their blood, since it was considered a crime against the state itself. The solution was to bury the condemned woman alive in an underground chamber with a single day's supply of bread, water, and oil, then seal the entrance and walk away. No blood was shed. The law was satisfied. The woman suffocated or starved in the dark, alone, for a vow she may or may not have broken, judged by men who faced no equivalent penalty for anything. Rome considered this restraint. Records survive of at least a dozen Vestals executed this way across the Republic and early Empire, most during periods of political crisis, when the state needed a visible explanation for why the gods seemed angry with it. 10 stories. 10 different empires, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history, and each one solved a problem. Succession, rebellion, secrecy, sacrifice, with a method that still sounds invented today. It wasn't. Every civilization that has ever congratulated itself on being advanced has, somewhere in its own records, a story exactly like these. The only real difference between the ancient world and now is which stories survive to be written down.